not that difficult to do, to be honest with you. So that was passed on, that's been passed on via mass transmission from the time of the Prophet up until today, and we still do that as well. We still memorize the Quran with that chain of transmission. So if you study the Quran with your teacher, after you finish memorizing the Quran, they'll give you what's called an ijazah, which is like a certificate or permission to teach. And in that ijazah, it will actually mention that you have your name at the end, and it will say that you took it from your teacher, who took it from his 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 teacher. So you have a list of about 40 teachers all the way back to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. They might say Ali or Ibn Masud, to the Prophet Muhammad, to Gabriel, and then it will say to Gabriel, and then it will say to Allah, to God, on the actual certificate. So we still do that. We've got the written text, but the written text isn't the primary source of preservation for us. It's the fact that it's been memorized by hundreds in every single age. But we have the written text as well. So they're looking to the Quran, and it needs somebody who understands the language of the Quran. So the scholars of Islamic legal philosophy, they'll speak about the wording. How can we derive a ruling from the different wordings of the Quran? Is it a clear wording, or is it something that is indicative of a ruling that we can infer from that wording? Okay, is the wording general? Is the wording specific? Okay, can we make a specific ruling from that generalization that's in the Quran or not? So it's quite detailed, even just that topic of how we extrapolate rulings from the Quran. There's entire books that have been written on that topic alone. The second source of legislation is the hadith, or what's called sunnah. Okay, so they call it sunnah. Sometimes, especially when the word sunnah is used with the Quran. So if you hear Muslims saying Quran and sunnah, what they mean by that is Quran and hadith. Okay. Sometimes sunnah, it has other connotations, which we'll discuss later on. But when we're speaking about the sources of legislation, when we say sunnah, it means hadith. So what is a hadith? Is a saying or an action or a tacit approval from the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Okay, so that's something that's been recorded. Okay, so some of the companions either memorized his statements or his actions, and some of them even wrote that down as well in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Some of the companions actually wrote them down, and they were also compiled later on. So if we don't find something in the Quran, we'll look in the hadith, and we'll try to find something there. And there's a great corpus of hadith. There are, for example, one book by an imam called Imam Ahmad contains about 30,000 hadith. So there are about 30,000 hadith just in that one compilation. So it's a quite a detailed topic, a detailed subject, and it's not for a layman. The third one is scholarly consensus, which is the agreement of Islamic scholars of jurisprudence in a particular age on a certain matter. Okay, it might be something that's already mentioned in the Quran, it might not be. Okay, it might be something that is new, a new situation. It hasn't been mentioned in the Quran, it hasn't been mentioned in the Hadith, yet there's agreement upon this particular matter. And the fourth one is analogy. Okay, I've highlighted it in yellow because a small group of scholars, they debated whether it was valid to use analogy, and in the end they ended up using a certain type of analogy anyway. So what analogy means is that we already have a ruling in the Quran or in the Hadith, and we have another new matter that is shares the same cause as this particular ruling. So we're going to give it the same ruling. So for example, drinking wine is prohibited in the Quran. Okay, the Quran mentions wine that is prohibited for Muslims to drink. Okay, how do we do analogy with other, alcoholic drinks? What about vodka? What about beer? Okay, or WKD or Alka Pops? You have them in the time of the Messenger of Allah. How can we say they're prohibited? So the scholars, they'll look at the original ruling. What is it about wine that makes it prohibited? Is it because it is red in color? Is it because it's, contained in a certain shaped bottle, or you drink it from a certain type of glass? What is it? Why is it prohibited? Okay. And just, the obvious reason is that it's because it intoxicates a person. Okay, it clouds one's judgment and puts a person in a state of intoxication. Okay, so we will use that ruling, say that's the cause of the prohibition. And if we find that in anything else that we drink, we'll give it the same ruling, that it will be prohibited. Okay, so if we have, vodka that does the same thing that wine does, intoxicates, then it will have the same ruling. Okay, we'll say it's prohibited. So that's how, a common example of analogy that is mentioned in the text. There are other sources of legislation that are not agreed upon. The first four, they're pretty much agreed upon, that we use them as sources of legislation. But these ones, there's debate or whether they can be used, or scholars have used them in varying degrees. So one of them is the opinion of a companion of the Prophet. Can we use the opinion of the companion of the Prophet Muhammad? So there's nothing in the Quran, there's nothing in Sunnah, there's nothing in scholarly consensus. Okay, but we've got this companion holding this view on a particular matter. It might even contradict analogy. So there's a discussion whether we can use that or not. Another one is legal discretion, what we call istihsan, which is very interesting. So some scholars say we can override analogy. We can override analogy and use what's called legal discretion. So it may be that analogy, it puts people in hardship. And, the general principle in the Sharia is that you're supposed to remove hardship and difficulties. So we use legal discretion to override the ruling. Or it may be that all of the Muslims are doing a particular action. Okay. Like a manufacturing contract is one, but it contradicts analogy. The analogy dictates that you shouldn't be able to sell something that you don't have, that doesn't exist. But because all the Muslims are doing it, we're going to override that analogy. And so on. So that's quite detailed, but we won't go into it too much here. Obviously, they can't contradict the first three. Okay, so none of these things that we mentioned here can ever contradict the first three sources. Okay.